In our earlier episode, Economic Change, Growth of Capitalism and Big Business, we learnt about the formation of big trusts, such as the United States Steel Corporation by Andrew Carnegie, the Standard Oil Company by John D. Rockefeller, the Railway Trust by James Jeremy Hill, Edward Henry Harriman and Jay Gould, the Copper Trust by Mayer Guggenheim, and the Money Trust by Joshua Morgan and John Morgan. Gradually, trusts began to pervade all walks of American life. They helped raise the standard of living, but they also tried to monopolize all economic activities. They used to put people into misery by controlling the price line in an undemocratic manner.
Everywhere the giant monopolies, the chain stores, they decided the market, and people had to go into these supermarkets without any option left. The undue advantage of liberalism and liberty given to the entrepreneurs resulted in curtailment of people's rights, democratic rights at a stage. And instead of democracy, what Cooper had already said, there was industrial despotism.
So, sir, America is a land of democracy. How could industrial despotism exist there?
That's what I said. There was unbridled freedom granted to the industrial entrepreneurs, tycoons. That was also a kind of individualism, liberty and democracy. But excess of liberty also leads to concentration of liberty in the hands of only a few persons. That results in despotism. And Cooper has called it industrial despotism in the sense that all the big industries, even small industries, are all gulped by the big industries. And therefore, there was no free competition among several industries. And the smaller industries were wiped off. So these are all symptoms of despotism rather than democracy. And this swing from democracy to despotism was a bane of American life. A time came when people felt cornered, and the wealth that was generated went into selfish hands in search of the rights and liberties, in search of free choice, in search of the existence of smaller companies, even in the face of bigger companies. They wanted the federal government to protect them. So federal intervention was at that time sought after by many sections of the people, The total polarization between plutocrats and people had taken place. There was another fact that because of this kind of complete free hand given to big businessmen, there was overproduction and goods were not selling well. If the buyers were pauperized and the industrial tycoons were given a free hand, they would, as a consequence, overproduce. There would be recession in the market, depression in the market in the end. So that had also come through. So capitalism had reached a point of attrition. Beyond that, it would crack. So therefore, they had to democratize the industrial system. They had to bow down to the consumers. Otherwise, the industry would not run. So out of this selfish reason also, they thought of a change. They thought of some measures through which the economic anomalies could be corrected.
In the last quarter of the 19th century, America passed through radical economic changes, which left a deep impression on the social life, eventually affecting contemporary politics. A lot of new ideas, both economic and political, took shape, leading to what has often been characterized by historians as the Progressive Era. Progressivism is a political and social term that refers to ideologies and movements favoring or advocating changes or reform. Progressivism is often viewed in opposition to conservative ideologies. In the United States, the term progressivism emerged in the late 19th century as an offshoot of the myriad changes brought about by industrialization. It was an alternative to both the traditional conservative response to social and economic issues and also to the more radical streams of socialism and anarchism which opposed them. According to John Halpin, senior advisor on the staff of the Center for American Progress, progressivism is an orientation towards politics. It's not a long-standing ideology like liberalism, but a historically grounded concept that accepts the world as dynamic. Professor Palith, however, gives a rather leftist definition of progressivism following the characterization by James Weinstein.
Progressivism in the face value means that they wanted progress of the American society in general, taking the people in their stride. Progressivism should be all pervasive, should benefit all and leave no one high and dry. That was the purpose of progressivism. But as the New Left historian Weinstein has put it, that the wave of progressivism was not so to liberalize capitalism and bring in welfare, bring in the human face of capitalism and banish the ugly face of capitalism. That was not the only consideration. Progressivism was almost, as he says, a life belt to save capitalism in America. So that is the hard reality.
Political parties such as the Progressive Party, organized at the start of the 20th century, and progressivism made great strides under many American presidents such as Theodore Roosevelt, William H. Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Lyndon B. Johnson, as an initiative to rein in the unbridled rapaciousness of capitalism. The first messiah of progressivism was Theodore Roosevelt. He initiated prosecution of big business with the slogan, "For social control." He was also sympathetic to the American laborers and consumers. Theodore Roosevelt has been described by Richard Hofstadter as basically a conservative, a Republican who tried to be a liberal, a progressive, a Democrat.
But he was trying to do good too. It is said that he was a sincere humanist, tried to correct the abuses of capitalism and reach out to the common people. But if we take on the Weinstein view, then he was only trying to safeguard capitalism. Capitalism was at a critical point. It was in a state of collapse because of recession and because of depression coming in. They were overproduced and there were no takers. So at that time, progressivism had to come as a life belt to American capitalism, to safeguard American capitalism by somehow protecting the interests of the consumer, returning some purchasing power to them. Capitalism could survive. Otherwise, there was no future for capitalism. In this context, well, we can say that he had some kind of baptism, some kind of conversion. He becomes a progressive.
Theodore Roosevelt introduced the phrase "square deal" to describe his progressive views in a speech delivered after leaving the office of presidency in August 1910. I stand for the square deal, but when I say that I am for the square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity and of reward for equally good service. The square deal was formed upon four basic ideas, namely conservation of natural resources, regulation of business monopolies, enforcement of the Antitrust Act, and promotion of progressive ideas. Borrowing the concept from the book Social Control, written by a progressive sociologist, Edward A. Ross, in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt developed his policy of square deal.
You know that even before him, when there were other presidents like Grover Cleveland, or even before him such presidents like Hughes, or before him Garfield, these presidents were there. They've all been heading towards, I think it was during the time of Grover Cleveland most probably, when they already thought of special acts, antitrust acts. They thought of Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the malpractices of trade and commerce across the border of states. They also thought of some kind of autonomy for the states, industrial policies, and autonomy of the municipal corporations. These things are already thought of. You know, it's quite different from what later Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, would call his program as New Freedom. New Freedom is more pro-people. But square deal means he is sitting as a Daniel come to judgment and tries to correct the abuses of capitalism. That is the inner meaning of the word square deal. Some checks are already being introduced during Grover Cleveland. Interstate Commerce Act, then Antitrust Act, etc. Then freedom of the state industrial policy, autonomy of the municipal corporation, some restriction on the railroads monopolies. So already some of these had come, and in that trail came the square deal measures. The first measure that we remember in the series of measures under square deal was known as the Elkin's Act. Elkin's Act was passed in the very beginning of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency from 1901, possibly 1903, when the Elkin's Act was passed. Elkin's Act was basically an antitrust act. It's a revival of the antitrust acts which were already passed during Grover Cleveland. So antitrust acts means the government would not allow formation of many new trusts and would like to dislocate the existing monopolistic trusts. You cannot combine 8 or 10 companies together, form a conglomerate. By law, this conglomeration was stopped. That is called antitrust law. And wherever possible, the trusts were disentangled into individual companies. That was the thrust of this first act, known as the Elkin's Act of 1903. Then he passed the Hepburn Act. These are all federal laws, mind you. Now, Hepburn Act was passed. Hepburn Act was basically the repeat of the Interstate Commerce Act. Now, its main purpose was to regulate the interstate trade and commerce in the name of democratic federalism. Wherever there were malpractices, they were all plugged by the government. There are a lot of commercial malpractices, licensing, etc., money transfer. There are areas where interstate commerce would mean giving undue advantage to the conglomerates. Even freight charges were minimized for them for interstate commerce. So there were many fields where they were getting advantage. So under Interstate Commerce Act, which is now in its new incarnation, Hepburn Act, Theodore Roosevelt, he insisted that all these malpractices within interstate commerce must go and democracy in industrialism should be restored. So that was the second very important measure. The third that I recall is Working Men's Compensation Act, which was slightly almost the same time, 1803 to 6, that is the period, 1903 to, not 18, sorry, 1903 to 6. This is the period when this Working Men's Compensation Act was also passed. By that, you all know that the workers have two demands. One is improvement of wages, another is reduction of hours of work. These two are granted. These two are granted. The revision of wages took place under Working Men's Compensation Act. Now that profit margin had grown so much for the tycoons, there some benefit, some sharing of the wealth should also come to the workers. So that was conceded by this act, Working Men's Compensation Act. And various other compensation packages and fringe benefits were introduced. And hours of work would also be standardized. That is not more than 8 hours of work. Better working conditions, airy and well-ventilated, well-lighted workplaces, then abolition of child labor, then the abolition of the differences, discrimination between male labor and female labor. All these things had come under Working Men's Compensation Act, which Theodore Roosevelt assured, and that law was passed. Then he went on further on this, and he had a law called Forest Reserve Act. Forest Reserve Act was something to save the green. He is also known as the father of the green movement. Now, 150 million acres of forest area were preserved by him, by law, so that this could happen. So this was also part of the measure during this period, that Forest Preservation Act, and forest was saved for general people. So this is also one of the aspects of the square deal measures. In this way, we find quite a few measures were undertaken, and more could be mentioned, but these are the main ones which he proposed and got enactments passed. But we find that in terms of implementation of the acts, actual practical implementation of the acts, his accomplishment was much less than the following President, Howard Taft. Taft had silently achieved much more than Theodore Roosevelt, who had been described as a prophet of progressivism. Nevertheless, he had initiated some of the essential acts of his period, and he had pushed them through. So some credit must be given to him on this score. From the background study and from the need of the moment, he cannot compare with Woodrow Wilson or an earlier president like Abraham Lincoln or a president like Andrew Jackson. They were true Democrats. So Lincoln's party would be called Democratic Republican Party. Nevertheless, it was more democratic than Republican. So if we place him in the pantheon of presidents of United States, then possibly he would rather appear to be just a liberal Republican. He was not, from that point of view, a true Democrat. And square deal means that he wanted to redistribute wealth in the country. It is making things fair and square. And he was not that kind of a committed pro-people president. He was not a. He was a champion of the aristocrats, no doubt about that. He wanted to. His main anxiety actually was to safeguard capitalism by liberal doses of reform. That's what he did. Safeguarding capitalism by liberal doses of reform. Not out of the concern that people were being deprived. There was the wretched of the earth. There were the other side of America, as Michael Harrington says, the poor people of America for whom these measures must come through. That was not his concern. His commitment was to the capitalists. But for capitalism to run smoothly in America, he was looking after consumer interest. That was the square deal at that time. And we cannot say that he was a real champion of the common people. So that was, in brass tacks, that is where we have to place Theodore Roosevelt.
So was it a corrective measure, or did it serve a greater interest?
To start with, as I have already explained, it was a corrective measure. It was a corrective measure, as I was repeatedly harping on that theme, to safeguard American capitalism. But in the long run, as we shall see when we proceed further in subsequent episodes, that it was a problem, it was a crisis of capitalism. It is there. It's a crisis of capitalism. So it is not that the 4 to 8 years of presidency of Theodore Roosevelt was the only period of crisis for capitalism. It was going to stay for a longer period, because American capitalism had reached, it had reached that point. It was what we call bursting at the seams, that kind of a situation. And to save it, interim measure wouldn't do. Much more broad-based measure had to be made and had to be passed. And the crisis was a long-lived one. It is not the crisis of the initial years of the 20th century. It was going to take place throughout the 20th century. So it was not a problem of a particular period of history. It was not a period piece. It had the problem was higher magnitude, of longer duration, for which other presidents had to come to continue what Theodore Roosevelt had proposed. But I had already said, Theodore Roosevelt proposed many things, but he did not really implement them very much. There was a difference. There was a difference between prattle and practice. He made the whole thing dramatic by his announcements, but silently Howard Taft, who came as president after him, he actually implemented most of the measures. The acts were passed, they were in the statute book, but they were translated into practice by Howard Taft, more correctly. So therein lies the limitation of Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was more interested in, dramatic things. He was the person who would extend American foreign policy into the Pacific. He was interested more. He was that side of Theodore Roosevelt as a jingo. As we can say that American frontier had ended, but the sea front was open for American capitalism to expand. There also he was the pioneer. That is his situation. You have got no further question, then I stop here. Thank you.
In this episode, Dr. Chittobroto Palith has dwelt upon the evolution and spread of progressivism in America. He first discussed the crisis of the Gilded Age, an era of big business and capitalism in which the industrial democracy was transformed into industrial despotism. Then he discussed the implications of progressivism based on interpretation given by John Halpern, senior advisor at the Center for American Progress, and James Weinstein, the New Left historian. He told us that progressivism was a contribution of President Theodore Roosevelt in order to rein in the unbridled rapaciousness of capitalism at the turn of the 20th century. Then he outlined Roosevelt's square deal measures through which the President intended to bring about social justice and fairness. Dr. Palith discussed how Theodore Roosevelt tried to control the monopolies and trusts, reach out to the poorer people through the federal legislations against trusts. He spoke about Elkin's Act 1903, which sought to break up the monopolies and trusts. He spoke about the Hepburn Act, whereby the interstate commerce and its malpractices were sought to be regulated by the federal government. Then he discussed the Workmen's Compensation Act, which intended to improve the conditions of the labor by promising them decent wages out of the wealth generated by the capitalists, humane working conditions, fixed hours of work, abolition of child labor, and equalization of wages across genders. Then Dr. Palith spoke about the Forest Reserve Act, which Roosevelt passed towards the end of his second term. 150 million acres of green were set aside as national forest, giving enormous benefit to the people and for the environment. And finally, Dr. Palith undertook an evaluation of President Theodore Roosevelt as the first propagator of progressivism. Following Richard Hofstadter and Weinstein, he opines that the proponents of progressivism were actually trying to safeguard American capitalism. Deal measures were actually life belts to American capitalism rather than to American democracy or the American common people.